Hello, low ego action heroes. This is Debbie Levitt from deltacx.com, and welcome to our last guest of 2020. No! Well, actually, 2020 can be done. But I'm very excited about this one. This is someone new to me, and probably new to you too. This is episode 89. What is human factors engineering? And I don't totally know either, so we're all going to learn something today. Put on your thinking caps. Today is November 25th, 2020. As usual, you are welcome to ask your questions live in the YouTube channel as well as in LinkedIn. If you want to tweet your questions, which no one ever has, you can use hashtag DeltaCX. I'll be tracking you there. And of course, if you are on the YouTube, please remember to subscribe and empathize with the like button and let the algorithm know you enjoy these broadcasts. And on that note, I am going to bring in today's guest, who I believe is pronounced Tiffany McIntire, but didn't ask her. So, Tiffany, you're new to me. I'm so happy to meet you. Please spell your name for people listening on the audio-only version, and then tell us who you are.
Yeah. So my name's Tiffany McIntire. It's Tiffany, and McIntire, McIntire. So it's a little bit different than the traditional spelling. I'm a human factors engineer. I've been working as a human factors engineer for pharmaceutical companies for the past 6, almost 7 years next year. And yeah, I've really enjoyed it and I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I wanted to talk first about, I think there's some confusion between what's UX, what's human factors. Are these the same? Are these different? Can you help us out a little bit?
So my understanding is that human factors is a little bit older than UX. So human factors got its start in the 1940s. There were a group of psychologists and they were trying to find the perfect human to fly this airplane that they had built. You know, it was a really complicated cockpit, like it was a beautiful piece of machinery, and all of the people that they were finding at that point in time just kept having all these use errors. But like, of course, the machine itself is perfect. So first round of psychologists, couldn't really find anybody. Second round of psychologists, they started having this idea, well, what if we start fitting the machine to the person? And so that's where you get the evolution of human factors psychology, human factors engineering. A big difference, I think, between UX and human factors primarily is going to be like how rigid we are, how systematic we are to some extent. And that's not to say UX is not that way. It's just more that our target is around patient safety in the healthcare space, but just overall safety. So it could be applied to a manufacturing setting to make sure that the people that are working there are engaging in safe behaviors. Could be applied, it's very commonly applied in aerospace, nuclear power plants, and then also with, like I said, healthcare. So anything where like a use error or some confusion on the user's part, and we have issues with the user interface, could result in people getting hurt or dying, then human factors definitely gets applied. I think that's a good high level.
It sounds like UX in case of emergencies.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so like UX times 10. And tell us, first of all, how did you even hear about it? Because when I looked at your LinkedIn, it seemed like you were, before you were the superhero you are today, you were a regular everyday person. How did you learn about human factors?
I'm really lucky. So he calls himself my fairy godmother, Jim Kirshner. He works at Eli Lilly. So I was graduating from my bachelor's in psychology. At that point in time, I was really into industrial organizational psychology, which is workplace psychology for anybody who hasn't really heard of that field before. And I applied for all these master's and PhD programs, didn't get in, and was just sitting there like, okay, what am I going to do for the next year until I can apply again? And Jim kind of showed up and I heard about it and got really excited and very fortunately got the job. So that's, my Cinderella story.
And so you ended up, so it sounds like were you working in it before you did the master's?
So the master's that I attended for, I did that in human computer interaction. So I've been working at Lilly as a human factors engineer for about a year. And during that time said, okay, I want to understand a bit more about like UX, user-centered design, and more of like a formal training program. So I attended for my HCI master's program. I did not complete it. I think that you and I had like a little bit of an offline conversation about that, or I talked to someone recently. It's similar to human factors, but I just found that the program didn't have this rigidity that I was used to, and it came a little bit more closely to marketing to some extent.
Ooh.
And then some of the tools, it felt like to me, and like I hope nobody like thinks poorly of that program because of what I just said, but it's just that. So the difference between like what a UX designer does in their everyday tasks is very different than what I'm doing.
Yeah, that's going to be a great next question. But first, we have a hello from Ikening in the YouTube channel who says, "Woohoo! I'm certified from HFI and it's touted as the grandfather of UX. Thanks for this episode, Debs and Tiffany." So thanks for joining us, Ikening, new friend of the show. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the differences between the day-to-day work of the average UX researcher or designer and the human factors engineer. Let us know. What's the story?
I think just like with UX, you can have it split into so many different areas. Like you could have the people that manage the content, people who are doing like the work frame flows and all of that. With human factors, at least in my position in a pharmaceutical company, I'm doing a lot of management activities, let's say. So if I were working at a medical device company, I think there are less barriers and restrictions for me directly doing the usability testing myself. I am capable, and so for internal purposes, like I've done that, but more, when I'm with being abroad with non-native speakers, in the company that I work in, I live in Switzerland, it's a little bit different. So I manage a lot of vendors that are doing human factors work. So there's some that are located in the UK, sometimes in the US. So Core Human Factors is an example of one, Kaleidoscope, Kinnear Dufert. So these are different groups that really specialize in medical device development, human factors work. So there's a specific science to how the moderators guides are set up, how questions get asked. So for example, we would set the product in front of somebody and say, I'd like you to imagine that you just got home from the pharmacy and that I'm not here to help you. And then every time the person asks questions, say, that's a really great question. I'll write that down, but I can't answer it right now. And so like as naturally as possible, they kind of go through and just rely on the material that they have to perform an injection, for example. And you can just kind of probably hear that that's a little bit different than the UX world, because in UX, I think you have more freedom sometimes to go and grab any user to some extent. I know that sometimes there are very specific markets, but within ours, it's customer segmentation, these personas, they get broken down much more further into what's the patient, what are the comorbidities they could have as a patient, does that impact their ability to see, hear, and their dexterity, and then recruiting specifically for those people to make sure that we're meeting their needs with the product.
UX is supposed to work like that, but I think we know that at some companies they are like, just test it on Jim, he sits over there, and it's not always happening. So maybe it sounds like the human factors angle maybe approaches these things a little bit more, would it be fair to say strictly or by the book or scientifically?
Definitely. I think in a lot of cases, our data is regulated. So when for a nuclear power plant, we do this through a risk assessment. So we have all the use steps that it takes to perform a task or to reach a goal. So all the different use errors that are possible, everything we're doing to prevent that from going wrong. So it could be, if it was a graphical user interface, it could be something pops up as a warning message. Would you really like to proceed? And we test the effectiveness through the usability testing. So we kind of we call it traceability through all of these things to make sure we can ensure it's a safe product. And if we have issues in a post-market world around usability, that really comes back to that testing. So we have to make sure that we do it with a lot of integrity and by the book for sure.
Yeah, well, it sounds like especially in a regulated industry, so pharmaceutical, banking, or finance, and some of these other ones, maybe because a lot of us end up working in software or e-commerce, it's not regulated and it ends up getting a little slippery in how we do things. Maybe that's some of the difference. So I know very often some of our low ego action heroes are curious how to get into something like this. Is this the sort of, is human factors a sort of thing where you can just take a few online courses?
She
really laughed at me.
It is complicated. So like I work primarily with engineers, and it is surprising to people that I have a title as an engineer, a person with a psychology background. So I think in my environment, I am really well supported by all these different cross functions that I work with that help me to fill in some gaps in my knowledge. So starting with a bachelor's, coming into Lilly, I had a lot to learn. There was a lot that I didn't know. So like what I brought to the table in that situation was I knew about how to do proper user testing, different things that can influence people's behavior, how to do literature reviews, and just like proper human behavior research, let's say. And so like those are the strengths I brought to the table. But what I learned, like the ass kicking that I got for the first year or two, was all these regulations. How do you do proper documentation, good documentation practice, like all this manufacturing stuff, things that biomedical engineers might learn. So
yeah, it sounds like some domain knowledge.
Yeah. So sorry if I'm ranting a little there, but like
no, go for it.
Basically, I think you can come from a different background. So if you've already been in the medical device space, if you've been in the pharmaceutical industry, I think it is a bit easier to sidestep into this, but because you'll bring certain strengths, but you have to come up with an open mind, knowing that you're going to have a lot of weaknesses to make up for. So I find coming from a psychology background, it's a lot easier to pick up on these other things because I can learn them at a high level and I don't have to be an expert. But as far as like being an advocate for the user and just like the UX people that are on people that listen to this probably understand about UX, like understanding human behavior is really at the core. So I think that that's the best background to have. But specifically getting into human factors, I think the best university for medical devices is Tufts. They do a bachelor's and a master's program. Oh, did you go to Tufts?
I went to Tufts and I was pre-med in music and dropped the pre-med after physics with calculus and finished with music. So I thought I would be a genetic researcher and somehow ended up a UX chick. So yay, Tufts!
I think they have a great program. I have not personally attended it, but the people that I've met that come from that program they are so good at what they do. I think become prepared coming out of their training. Loughborough University, they used to have a PhD in human factors program. It's more switched, I think, to user-centered design now. But the human factors programs themselves are kind of hard to come by. So Purdue University, I'm originally from Indiana. And Purdue University, I think they have an interesting program where there's a good overlap between the School of Industrial Engineering and then the School of Psychology. And human factors really does have to merge approaches from both. So I think that's also a good one. So that was a very long answer.
Looking at your LinkedIn, so you did Indiana University, Purdue, and that was master's. Purdue was also your bachelor's, industrial and organizational psychology. And so that was, but then you were able to get into human factors from there. So it's not like you had to specifically have a degree in human factors engineering.
Yeah, I would say that I got very lucky. A lot of people aren't super familiar with human factors. I think probably, and I hope that no one gets offended if they hear this, but I think one of the easiest ways to get into it is actually through consultancies. Because a lot of consultancies, what they will do is they'll hire people that they could have a communications bachelor's degree. I think they have to demonstrate a certain amount of aptitude or like willingness to learn. It could be from sociology as well. There are a lot of social sciences that I probably forgot to mention that are a good base as well as psychology, anthropology, sociology, social work even to some extent, because they do have a lot of humanities background. But anyways, so these consultancies will take people with a bachelor's and they're willing to do that training, and they'll kind of do like where you would be doing like be a note taker in the usability studies, and you'd be able to kind of observe like the study logistics, how things are playing out, and you're just writing down what you hear as much as possible and then convening with the moderator afterwards. And so after someone does that for a period of time, they graduate to moderator, and then after moderator, project manager. So that is a good position as an early career professional. And if you're not able to get directly into some other human factors roles, I think it's a good one because you can work with a lot of different products, a lot of different companies, and kind of get a feel for the expectations that are out there.
Yeah, so again, circling back, it does sound like the type of job that really might require that university level education versus, hey, I read a book, or hey, I took a boot camp, or hey, I took a few Udemy courses. You're nodding. The people listening on audio only won't hear that. She's nodding.
Yes, I agree with everything you just said.
Okay. And obviously, there are some companies out there who claim they will train you in human factors and then you can pass a certification. Do those tend to be good sources? Are they okay sources? Are they bad sources? Do you have an opinion on those, even if we don't name names?
I'm not aware of a lot of like human factors certification programs out there because even in like the tiers of human factors engineering, there are many people that would probably that are, I would say, OG human factors engineers that they might have a certification. Like there's this CIE-HF certification, and that requires a lot. One of the requirements is that you have a human factors degree from a list of universities that they've agreed that are proper universities.
Wow. Okay.
Another way to get CIE-HF certified. I'm not CIE-HF certified. It's the UK certification program. As another way is like that you have a mentor or someone in the field with you that can kind of vouch for your abilities as a human factors engineer, despite you not having that formal training. So if there are boot camps out there, that's interesting, but most of the time I see consultancies coming in, giving people a certain degree of training, but not so that they can start doing it themselves, more that they can recognize what projects really require human factors and how early in the project timeline to start engaging these external consultancies to help them out with what work do I need to do, how much. Yeah.
Okay. And
unless you've like found
No, I didn't find anything. And it sounds like Econing is going to be our main questioner today. And they're asking, what do you consider important elements of human factors engineering?
There are many levels I can interpret that question. I think the most important is at the beginning that we do a lot of secondary research to understand the users, but then having, like, at least in my situation, a very close connection with clinical and also marketing to understand the full scope of the product. How is it supposed to be used? It's like everything. It's always going to start with having a deep understanding of the context of use. I think once you start digging into understanding your users, we start splitting them into what we call distinct user groups. So you might have, okay, this product is indicated for patients with diabetes. Okay, is it type 1 or type 2 diabetes? Is it an adult? Is it a child? How long have they had diabetes? It might kind of like start giving you some more questions about how willing are these people going to be to self-inject? What's their patient journey look like? I think that's where like UX and human factors do become very similar, because the people that are good at that work, they know that that's what's going to be important, because it reduces the amount of surprises at the end, but really just ensures that you're building a product truly for the end user.
It really sounds like in some ways the OG UX was human factors, and then somehow something splintered off at some point, and certain parts of UX, not all of them, got a little bit light or fluffy or too graphically oriented. I think of myself as OG science chick, but there are certainly some people who think UX is just sketch pretty screens. It sounds like you can't really get away with that in human factors. No one's going to say, "Hey, Tiffany, thanks for working here. Can you just sketch some screens?" Oh, you're laughing.
The version of that we get is, I would say, getting involved too late in the timeline. They're kind of like, oh, like, we've built this perfect product. Now you're going to test it and tell me it's good, right? Yeah. Which I think every usability professional experiences. The best partnerships is when we can start early on together, and that the team is really invested towards building a product for the patient. And I do feel like my role in my teams is to bring the patient into our work. So, as engineers, it's pretty easy to kind of get swept up into your day-to-day. Okay, we've got to get it to perform this, that it injects, 2 mLs in this amount of time, and that nothing goes wrong in that. And then the other people that I work with more in the clinical side, they're like, we built this great medicine, and it took, took decades for us to get here, from this being something on paper to something we're able to put into a clinical trial. And sometimes you have to sit down and say, hey, like asking someone to sit and shake something for 10 minutes, it's not going to work. You know, like it's sometimes having those hard conversations, but the earlier I can have them, the better. Yes. Because later in the timeline, it's people have all like banked on this. They're like, yep, we're ready to go.
Of course, people will shake it for 10 minutes. Of course, they're totally able to do that and interested in it and will remember. So thinking about some of the types of day-to-day things, are you doing research? Are you doing information architecture? Are you doing wireframes and prototypes? Are you doing things that UX peeps would be familiar with? Or do you kind of have other paths and processes and deliverables?
So the majority of the products that I work on are injection products. So pre-filled syringes, auto injectors, and things that and materials that support that. A lot of work with the instructions for use, the carton, figuring out, you know, within this medication regimen and even different regulations for different countries, how many injectors could somebody realistically get? Can they fit that in their refrigerator? So I ask I would say, different questions in the patient journey than a UX professional might, just because there's going to be differences with graphical user interface needs compared to these physical product needs. And then when it comes to the design itself, I would say, and it's probably good UX professionals as well feel this way, that it's our job to facilitate the right answer with a team, that we have our underlying principles that are, guiding our process or guiding the good designs that we want to create. But I wouldn't consider myself personally a designer. I actually work with design is another good background that you can come into human factors with, by the way. I work with the people on my human factors team are almost all designers. But yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought there.
It's okay. I'm dreaming of 4,000 questions. And a friend of the show, Marisol, is here, and she says, this is super interesting. I know, Marisol. I have 4 million questions, and I keep forgetting them. So would you say that, fresh question, and everybody ask questions. It looks like LinkedIn never told anybody that we were live, so hopefully we'll get some more people joining us on YouTube. We've got 4 people live on YouTube now. Thanks for joining us live, especially with American Thanksgiving tomorrow. And everybody who is flying tonight, if you are flying tonight, you are in trouble with both of us because she works in healthcare. So everybody stay home, look at the both of us. Would you say, and I could be wrong, that human factors might be a direction to go in if people are more interested in physical products, and that UX is sometimes more digital products? Or is there a digital side to human factors as well?
There's definitely a digital side. It just so happens that in a pharmaceutical company, that's the department that I've tended to work in. And because of the regulated space is so niche, it's just kind of what I've stuck in. But when I worked at Lilly, for example, and this is public information, that they do have digital products that they work on, and you'll often find in the insulin space or in the diabetes space that there are a lot of digital products that people are working with. So maybe Dexcom rings a bell with some people. That's a continuous glucose monitor that is, constantly telling you what your blood sugar is, and then that's going to an app in the patient's phone. And for example, with a child, it could be, if the child has a phone, but also the caregiver's phone, to continuously give you that medical information. So there are graphical user interfaces definitely involved with human factors and with healthcare. And that's where things do get sticky internally, to be very honest. That we oh, no worries.
No, go ahead.
So things get a little, they get a little sticky, and I don't want to say that there are turf wars, but I think always with design, there's going to be a little bit of a turf war, right? Sure. So sometimes, your researcher and your designer aren't really seeing eye to eye about what the design needs. And, you research, design, marketing, and then you have human factors on top of the UX team of professionals. And sometimes that can become challenging, where it's well, where does human factors stop? And then where do the UX professionals begin? And how do we work together on this is sometimes a challenge. I haven't worked in that space in quite some time, but I know internally as a company, roles and responsibilities, all of that, it can be fun.
Yeah, thank you. We've got another comment from Marisol, and I was thinking something along the lines of what she said. She said she's got arthritis, and sometimes she hates the packaging on the medications that don't seem to take into account what the patient is dealing with, like joint pain in hands. And I don't know if you're following Joel Barr on LinkedIn, but he was, I think, having a hand tremor, and he was trying to show how Walgreens, I don't know how long you've been away from America, but you might remember Walgreens. And Walgreens required him to use his phone to scan a barcode to renew his medication, and he wasn't able to keep his hand steady or something like that, if everyone saw that. And is that a oops, we didn't bring in the human factors person? Without naming any companies' names, does it sound like the human factors person didn't get to be on that project long enough?
Yeah. So, Marcel, thank you for letting us know. I think that it's important, and it's not always easy as a patient to self-identify in a public setting. So, thank you, Debbie. To answer your question, yeah, even in my own company, it's a $300 billion company that I'm working in now, and there are so many people. I'm in Roche Pharma, and then you also have Roche Diagnostics, and you just have all of these different silos, and people just aren't aware that we exist. So sometimes that is really a big part of my job, is to try to not self-promote, but to evangelize. That's the good term, is to evangelize and also talk about UX and talk about human factors and those user-centered requirements. A big trend, at least again in pharmaceutical companies over the past, how long have I been in this? Probably 8 years. It's possible 10 years, but in pharmaceutical companies, when they have medical devices like injection systems, that the packaging group actually gets put in the same department. And I think that that's helped us from a company perspective because, for example, right now I'm in a human factors packaging liaison role. So according to the regulations, the products that get human factors are just the combination products. And that's actually FDA driven, for the record. That's a US driven requirement, and EMA is following behind a little bit. We have ISO standards. That's the boring side of everything. But I will say that I appreciate this feedback, and I completely agree. My job right now, in one of my roles, is to identify those projects. And so I've kind of developed a questionnaire where it's easier for those teams to kind of say, okay, could there be issues from the disease state, comorbidities, whatever? And if someone says, I don't know, then I can come in and kind of help them build up that user profile and say, yeah, actually, I think that this patient group, we might want to do some usability testing. We might want to develop something custom for them. Consider where we put, for example, there's a tamper evidence seal that we have to have by regulation, by law, to make sure that, people don't open things and close them. Well, sometimes that makes it impossible to open the package.
Right.
So it's also designing those features to make sure that they don't work against our patients.
Yeah, and that makes me think of another thing. Tell me if human factors gets involved in any of the writing of the documentation that comes with a medication, because sometimes I read the documentation that comes with a medication and I go, this should be at the 5th grade level, but this appears to be at the master's degree level. And why does this use so many high and mighty words for things that could be said much more plainly, and especially for people who might have either literacy issues or assimilation issues? Who and I'm not looking to blame somebody, but whose job would that be?
That is a really great question. That's probably the biggest part of my job, is actually creating supportive labeling material. A lot of it has to do with warnings and how that's communicated, instructions for use themselves. So the graphics themselves, how the information's laid out, information hierarchy, how are we using color, is this going to be overwhelming, those types of things. So roles and responsibilities, and exactly to your point around the 5th grade, I think it might even be 7th grade level for both for EMA and then also for the US, that's what's recommended.
Okay.
But it's not for everything. So the patient, we call that the patient information leaflet, and that's the bit that has, here are the adverse events, severe adverse events, clinical trial data, and that's actually, it's intended that the patient has that available to them. But I would honestly agree with you that it's not designed for the patient to be reading so much, because if you don't have, I think, a bachelor's degree, you really can't understand what's in there.
Right. It's also
I
in
don't
like
ever.
-6 point font very often. Somehow
Yeah.
it's in like light gray text at -6 point font. I've just got old eyes, but other people have older eyes or different eyes. And I'm always like, holy cats. Like I have to read it by taking a picture of it with my phone and zooming in. And I'm otherwise normal visioned. I'm just, I've got glasses that I never wear because I'm that person who's like, I don't want to wear my glasses. Yeah, Marisol says text for ants. Very, very, very true. So it sounds like that's something that you can sometimes get involved in if somebody can kind of capture like, holy cats, we need to talk to Tiffany or someone like her during this process.
Yeah. So one of the things I try to advocate for with usability is that we separate what we call the patient information leaflet, which is basically clinical trial data. I wouldn't say it's designed mostly for the pharmacists to be able to understand it and read it, but really it is. And the same thing for the doctors, that they understand, what do I need to communicate to the patient before I give this to them, or what do I need to take into consideration? So we have to, basically consider like multiple users within our products. For example, the carton, I have to consider the pharmacist as a user of the carton. Does it display the information that they need, that they expect, so they can differentiate between drug products? Coming back to your point about the font and then also the literacy level, we do use that for sure with the instructions for use. So like what's intended to be like patient-facing materials, we do that. Other considerations is along with the font, you probably notice that sometimes a sheet of paper is like this big.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I literally probably
it's like
have
school science fair project paper. It's like giant paper folded into some sort of fortune cookie slip.
And then you get countries like Belgium where you have to do multiple languages, and then it's just really big. But what I try to do is sometimes, and this is like an older practice, and I think companies are getting away from it now, is separating the pieces of literature or sheets of paper, that we have the clinical trial information on one. Maybe some patients want to review that, but not everybody. And we really want people to open up the instructions for use. So
right, and understand some of the contraindications and yeah.
So like pulling out, having the instructions for use separated, that when they unfold it, it's not that big, that it's something that, they can place right in front of them. They don't have to move it around while they're going to give themselves an injection. So we try to consider things like that for sure.
Oh my gosh, so many things. We've got another great question from Ikening, and the question is, what makes a competent HFE practitioner? So I guess I'm sure at this point in your career, you can tell who's great at this and maybe shows up to a job and isn't so great at this, obviously without naming any names. What would you say makes you go, oh man, that person's great at human factors, or oh, holy cats, that person's faking it or not good?
I think it's probably like any job to some extent. One of the most important things is like, and I also had to learn this because I would say early in my career, I thought that I had to have all the answers. And I think it's just good to ask questions and say, hey, I don't know the answer to this, and just being open to that. I think a human factors person that I think teams always benefit from having a devil's advocate, that, you say you're going to do something, but then you're like, well, what's the value that we're really getting out of this? I think that's something that if you're asking yourself that it's important, like there's risk benefit. So what makes a good human factors practitioner? I think it's one where you can balance the needs of everyone, because I did go to a conference once and there was a woman who I think had clearly never worked internally for a company, because someone said, well, what do you do when you get a usability result and you find out that you can't manufacture it? And it's a good question.
Right.
What happens? And you really have to weigh it out. You can't, human factors or usability can't always get everything that it wants. So if we were going to build a perfect product, it might delay a patient getting medication that they need by a year or 2 years. And so you have to start weighing out like what's really important in this situation and really putting the patient first. And that kind of sometimes might mean putting your research or your ego aside and figuring out some sort of workaround, like how can we make this work? So it
On our
takes being
channel, we
creative.
call that the low ego action heroes.
Beautiful.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, being one of those.
Good. All right. So, anything that would make someone a bad human factors engineer?
Um, I think not having an open mind and thinking that you have all the answers, and that's probably true for every position everywhere. Um, I think sometimes we also can get caught up in the copy and paste culture where for us, we are doing something by regulation and you do have similar products that you work with. And I think, I try to apply human factors principles to my own practice where I'm like, okay, with every project, even if I can copy and paste some amount, I have to check these factors to make sure that they're also lining up. Um, Good example could be, so I'm trying to think of something that is not real. So you got that. So an auto injector that you administered to a rheumatoid arthritis population, which had extreme dexterity impairments, and you now want to use that same auto injector for a patient that has Parkinson's disease. And to us, like someone that's really user-centered, a patient-centered, we might be like, oh yeah, that's like pretty different. Someone else might just kind of gloss over it and be like, all right, let's copy and paste all the project
My gut feeling was that's totally different.
Yeah, it is. But like, again, if you go back to that risk assessment, it's a massive document, by the way. If you have to do one from scratch, they're quite labor intensive. But they are the bread and butter. They're the roadmap for everything that I do. It tells me if this patient makes this error, then, it has this kind of outcome. And in this instance, it could tell you the occurrence of that error. Or, sometimes it's important to just be like, I'm not even going to start with documentation, guys. We just have to get this into a study, as safely as possible. So in some instances, I might test actually a injection device that doesn't have a needle. So I have worked with some vulnerable populations, and you're just really trying to investigate, can this work for you? Because you want to give patients independence. I think that's a really important factor. As a company, sometimes people can get very conservative and they're like, well, we don't want to take on the liability of encouraging people to self-inject if they're not capable. But in the wild, wild west, like when, medications get prescribed, not every person has access to a caregiver. And, they just want to maybe just be responsible for their own stuff. Good example is young kids who live with chronic conditions. They start injecting at a pretty young age. Like, again, patients with diabetes or other chronic conditions where you need to self-inject around like 10 to 12 years old. It's kind of like with other, day-to-day things in their life. Like, they don't want their parents to have to remind them to do certain things or do things for them, like cut their steak. It's like, I'm going to do that myself. I'm an adult. And kind of applying that patient independence also to them. I got on a tangent there, sorry.
No, it's great. That's what we do here. I missed a question earlier from Amin, who asked, do you believe that human factors is kind of the granddaddy or mom of all of the other kind of UX fields?
Yeah, sure. Maybe. I think for me personally, so you've got, human factors engineering, user-centered design, human design thinking, like got a million ways that you can slice these things. And I think at their core, they're all basically the same. They all have the same intention. It's just sometimes the tools might differ a little bit. Some of the methodologies are just slightly different, but they're more similar than they are different. So I don't usually try to split hairs, to be honest.
No problem. So before we get to another Ikening question, let's go to Marisol. I'm sorry we have a small pool of people today because LinkedIn didn't tell people I was live, but at least we have engaged people. So Marisol is asking, how do you identify if someone has potential to work in human factors by just talking to them without seeing any portfolio? Is there something you can ask someone where you go, ooh, this person should probably work in human factors?
That's a really good question. So a portfolio, yeah. So for us, we actually, if you work in healthcare, you can't really have a portfolio for the most part, depending on like your relationship with your company and what you're allowed to show. Your portfolio could be like, oh, I designed that instructions for use, or I validated that instructions for use. Like, you'd kind of see certain things on their resume and start asking questions about that. It's like, okay, so I see here that you led this type of combination product or auto injector. What did you do? Like, what were the critical use errors, or what was this? And like, even though with the slang and the lingo that I use, if they don't understand that, it could tell me that they don't have experience maybe in my field of human factors, but we might have to find some common ground. It also just depends on like what level of human factors engineer you're hiring for. Recently, we hired someone who, she has a master's in psychology, and she's just been amazing. Like, she and I have spent, I would say intensive time every week training where like I'm telling her about everything, giving her different presentations, and she's just picked it all up like a sponge. So I would love to hire more psychology people and train them in the future, but experienced people.
I was going to say, it sounds like bachelor's or master's in psychology, cognitive psych, or organizational psych seem to be the gateway drug into human factors. So would you agree with that? Or are there other degrees that people can pursue that might be natural lead-ins? Design's a really good one, of course. I think some of the other ones that I'd mentioned, like anthropology, sociology, and like what you'd been saying. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Ekening, he's got a lot of questions today. So let's see. Keep them coming. Another one. You mentioned recruitment of test participants as being highly stringent. What other obstacles have you encountered that faces your industry, if you can share?
Yeah. It's actually interesting sometimes because what the FDA expects and then what we actually do, what we would consider like a good scientific practice, could be very different. Like we got into this for a while ago with differentiation. So when you're differentiating different insulin devices, it's kind of, I associate it with your toothbrush, but I do understand what the FDA is always getting at. You really have to assess the worst case scenario. So internally, we would be like, okay, you would never just pick a toothbrush up out of, cup of toothbrushes, not exactly knowing which one's yours to start brushing your teeth. You probably have seen that toothbrush before. You've probably used that toothbrush before, and you kind of remember like, yeah, that's my toothbrush. And so like, if you went to usability testing, I'm using a toothbrush as an example for an insulin pen because everybody has a toothbrush. Not everybody has an insulin pen. And kind of if you wanted to test like how easily can people differentiate our toothbrush from other toothbrushes that we sell and other toothbrushes other companies sell, you wouldn't just give them a whole bunch of toothbrushes and be like, all right, now which one is the Novo blah, blah, blah toothbrush? So
they might not care.
Yeah. And so and sometimes people just pick their favorite color. Sure. And for us, like we're freaking out because we're like, no, don't pick that one. And they're like, oh, but I like this color. And you're like, so why did you pick that? We don't actually freak out in front of them, but
right.
Exactly. So what we've ended up doing was in that scenario, the FDA had a very specific way that they wanted it tested. And they said, okay, you set out all the insulin pens, like all the common ones that could be in somebody else's house. So if you have diabetes, it's possible a family member also does. And you want to make sure that you don't confuse your insulin for their insulin, because that can literally be deadly. And so we'd set all of them in front of them and say, okay, I'd like you to pick out, and then we'd say which pen and then have them pick that one out. And it's kind of artificial to some extent, doesn't represent reality, but I think it tests your product almost to the extreme. Like how is your information hierarchy, or like your usage of color and these different differentiating factors working? Is it working the way you want it to? So I would say like sometimes it's working with the FDA to make sure that they're aligned to what your test methodology is. And that was a really big challenge. Like in 2011 is when their draft guidance came out. So it became that you had to submit this data, submit your protocols for what usability testing you're going to be doing to the FDA for review and getting their feedback. And sometimes that feedback takes a while, and sometimes you don't agree with it. So it takes time to sit down and talk.
Ooh, well, I think all these regulated industries have a lot of similarities there. Now, Ekening's asking a question that I'm assuming you can't answer, but I'm going to put it up anyway. Ekening, you cheeky devil. what were your career failures and how did you resolve them for the better? What were some of the consequences of those errors? I assume you might not be talking openly about any mistakes you've made at work, but I think we can also reframe this as, what would you tell your younger self that could have made your career better today?
I think, yeah, to me, those are almost two different questions. So the career failures I can definitely speak to.
Okay,
and
just checking.
Oh yeah, you're fine.
Okay.
Because nothing would ever get on the market that we, didn't believe in.
Okay.
Believe me, I've been the one to raise the flag and be like, nope, like we have to do this, in those meetings. So we have a good environment for that in pharma. But back to my career failures, everyone's favorite topic now. I think talking about failure is very important, and being open about it, that no person is perfect. But so what happened was I was early in my career, as you can imagine, and I was going to conduct a usability study, and it was with a very challenging population. Like I told you before, it was that population where it was like, can these people even self-inject with this disease? And, just trying to figure out, do they want to self-inject with this disease? Is this possible at all? And so there were a lot of early exploratory questions that we had. And so we'd kind of done usability test and then interview at the end. Interview at the end, that went fine because those questions are pretty straightforward. Usability test, I did not use my team the way that I should have. I was going to be a one-man show, and I was going to come up with this design and pull together all of our previous information and the market competitive stuff. And, and that was the biggest failure that I think I've ever had, because I got to the end of I didn't involve my team in the review and everything like that. And I think that's what's made me so collaborative now, is I never want to spend that much money for a usability study, first off, and all the effort that goes into that. And we did get something out of the study, but we could have gotten so much more if I would have just worked with my team. Ask them questions. You were
accidentally a high ego action hero.
100%.
Okay. Oops.
Yes.
It happens. Thank you for sharing that. Not everyone wants to talk about that, but thank you. I think we should. Amin is back and says, what advice would you give to those who are interested in human factors research-focused jobs, but might have little experience in human factors? Again, we tend to get a lot of questions on my channel about is there a book we can read? Is there a course I can take? Or ultimately, is this just a university psychology degree?
I think within HF, we're always looking for more HF people, but it's a mutual thing where it's like they aren't really aware of us, and then we're not really sure how to be aware of them. So I would say a good place to always start, or at least in my opinion, is find job postings and try to find somebody that works at that company and just start opening up the dialogue. If they don't respond, they don't respond, but don't just do it with one person, do it with many different people. It's expensive to attend conferences, and I do present at conferences where there's supposed to be it's not HFES, so there's Human Factors Ergonomics Society, and that is an academic conference. There are these smaller conferences that are more industry focused, and I find that very often you get people that are trying to learn about human factors that attend those. But like I said, they're very expensive, so I think the cheapest or easiest option in some sense is to start reaching out to professionals online, or you could volunteer at HFES potentially. It's been virtual recently, but they might still be accepting student volunteers or volunteers in general, so that you can go out there and see what it's about and meet people.
Another thing I advise people just in general is you can always go to LinkedIn, search for a job you want, and start looking at what they expect you to do and be and have. And so I've just put human factors engineer into LinkedIn, and I put remote, so that's going to limit in some cases what I get. But here is a job that says bachelor's or master's in human factors, ergonomics, or related discipline. Here's another job that says, they didn't say what they want you to be able to do. Let's see about this one. Let's see. Master's degree plus 10 years experience, or PhD plus 5 years experience. Yeah, Yeah, these are some high-level jobs that are popping up for me on LinkedIn. I did put in remote, so I guess they're looking for the big guns. Yeah, but here it is. And then it looks like in some cases you're expected to know IEC or ISO standards. Did you have to study like ISO 9241 or things like that? What did you study in the ISO universe?
So the ISOs that are my bread and butter would be 14971. It's a risk management ISO standard.
Okay.
Definitely. Like, another thing to throw out there is if you're interested in human factors engineering, get intimately familiar with systems engineering. Like systems engineering is it's a good concept as far as like everything in the system affects each other. I can elaborate on that a little bit later, but ISO 62366, also my bread and butter. That one literally lays out the process for medical device development with human factors, like what process you need to follow, what documents you need to have, and why. Those are the two ones that come to mind. There are a few others.
Did you study 9241? I think 9241 is like 90-something standards that are more related to UX.
Okay. I think I've probably heard about it, and I think I've quoted certain definitions from there, but I've never actually read it.
I looked on LinkedIn and there are like 5 jobs in the entire world that hope you know ISO 9241. So I wasn't very impressed, but I'm still trying to find somebody who's like, yes, you must know 9241. I don't know anything about it. Let's see. Ekening is back. Remember, we've got just about a few more minutes left, everybody, and then our time is up with Tiffany, so send in your last questions. And Ekening says, my understanding thus far has been you create solutions using a mixture of engineering techniques and UX. What's the ultimate state of human factors engineering? Ooh, that's a giant question, maybe. The ultimate state. What do you mean?
Yeah, I know. I was like, what's the ultimate state? I mean, I'll actually loop back to like the systems engineering thing that like, so you could have a systems engineer on your team, but that is one thing as a human factors engineer that I think sometimes people underestimate is like sitting in the team meetings and listening to the testing that's going on, because it's good to know like how the system is performing, to know like, okay, what failure modes would the user then have to like accommodate for? So if something breaks, is that visible? So like, for example, if something broke and the user's not aware that it's broken, then I would have to come into the team and say, hey guys, like that's not acceptable. Because if someone doesn't get their medication or this and it's not obvious to them, then they can't really do anything about it. But like, again, so systems engineering is just saying that everything is connected. Another good example from my field would be there was a product that I was working on. We do formative and then we do summative testing, for the record. So formative is 5 users per distinct user group. You do quick iterative forming the design testing.
So like concept testing.
Yeah. Okay. And then summative testing, that is where you have 15 users per distinct user group. And so, like I said before, it's like how I do with the patients, you could have many different indications for a single molecule. So it could be rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, et cetera. Or you could have one user group, like I said, with diabetes that gets split based on age and all these other factors, plus HCPs and caregivers. And at the very end, one of the requirements by regulation is that you have to test it with a production equivalent product. And so sometimes in the timeline that becomes challenging because they do a lot of testing in the engineering world, and then we want to submit the product as soon as possible, right? Like, because we want to get out the door to help the patient. And usability testing, it's like, you know, you get to the end and you get this off the production line product. And sometimes, you know, they put it in the manufacturing process, they put parts in a bag and it rolls, or maybe it hits a certain vibration and that actually impacts the device and causes some failures. So sometimes you get to the very end and then you have to start all over again. But sometimes, again, like a usability person might say, well, I don't have to have that one. You could, as long as it performs the way it's supposed to, then my usability testing is actually done. And so those are kind of two different philosophies, right? Is if it comes off the production line, I have the full system and I can actually assess a system effect, where that may not be possible in other instances, versus I've created a prototype that is supposed to represent how it's supposed to function, but maybe it's not 100% because you don't know these other things.
Wow, so much how do you juggle all this? You must feel like you're just is work fun?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, good.
I have a full cross-functional team. Like, a lot of this is I'm stealing words out of who in my team would be saying this, and we would be working together on these topics. So I'm not a one-man band, not at all.
Okay, you sound very collaborative, so that's a beautiful thing. We are in our last 5 minutes, believe it or not. So we're going to be winding down the show. I just want to do a couple of quick show notes. Just a reminder to everybody that you can still sign up for my Acture things. Got nothing to do with human factors, but if you'd like to learn UX prototyping, I'll be teaching that coming up soon. Please sign up. That's going to be December 3 and 4. It's only $60. And of course, please, if you are on YouTube, won't you please usability test the subscribe button and ring that bell so that you can know when we're live, because LinkedIn didn't tell anyone today we were live. Boo LinkedIn. Please make sure you're subscribing on YouTube. They're really good about that. And empathize with the like button. Let the algorithm know you actually like this stuff because you do. And of course, you can also join our Slack workspace if you'd like to be part of the low ego action hero community. Let's see. Outside of that, December is any minute now, and we don't have any more interviews coming up this year. I will be sending out a poll where everyone can vote for their favorite guest of the year, and in January we'll do some awards. I'll do a fake awards show, and so look for that. And other than that, tune in December. In addition to Tuesday office hours, Ask Me Anything, I'm going to do a bunch of micro lessons. So if you'd like to get a little bit more tactical with some things in UX and some principles, I will be teaching those live on YouTube on some Mondays and Wednesdays, and you are all always invited. We'll give you some last words. Tiffany, where can everybody find you, follow you, and are there any great gurus of human factors that people should keep an eye on, the way we tend to keep an eye on Don Norman and Nielsen Norman Group? How do we follow you, and who else do we follow?
So you can follow me on LinkedIn. Ron K, Ronkaye, I think is how you spell his name. He was one of the original human factors engineers working at the FDA all the way back in the 90s. He's a great person to follow. Ed Israelski is another one. I don't know how to spell Ed's last name. I won't even try. But I would say those are some of the grandfathers of human factors in medical device development, at least.
Okay, super. Thank you for that. And of course, it wouldn't be today without a last question from Ekening. And Ekening wants to know, what are some of your hopes for the human factors industry and your career?
For the industry, I think that we've made a lot of steps in the right direction, honestly aided by regulation. So the regulations have really given a lot of teeth to what we do. Like I said, starting in 2011, the FDA started rejecting products because they didn't have proper usability data or the proper science behind them. And I think it's just slow organizational change management from there, getting the awareness, updating the processes. So I think just continuing on the tracks that we're on. And the other thing that I would really like to see, at least within the pharmaceutical environment, is that we see it less as supporting the business case of a drug product and more as treating the patient as a whole. I would love to see much more medical devices from pharmaceutical companies talking to patients or engaging patients earlier in their patient journey before they require a medication intervention, and helping them engage in healthier lifestyles, or even tracking symptoms or things like that, algorithms or wearable products that can give them that feedback that they're not getting. To me, I would love to see that future of human factors and really just a future for the patient.
Yeah, sounds more proactive, maybe more automation and more home devices. I know we were showing my cardiologist some months ago, maybe this was last year, thanks to the pandemic, one of those little devices that's like a mini EKG thing. It's like $99 and it does your EKG. And he was like, no, get out of here. And he had just done an actual EKG on either me or my boyfriend. And then I think me, and then I used this little device and he compared it. And I think he said in Italian, holy shit. And he was like, that's pretty good. And so I think there's a great future in there. So many people are, too many questions, guys. We're out of time, but there is a question. How do we find out about the events on this channel? If you go to deltacx.com, in the navigation, go to events. Under that, you'll see live stream podcasts, and I do have a Google Calendar on that page, and that will tell you all of the upcoming events on the channel. Tiffany, we are out of time. So happy to have met you. Thanks for letting me grill you for an hour and taking questions from our fans and our show friends. Hopefully we'll come up with a reason to have you back at some point. And for now, I'm going to play everybody out of here and say happy turkeys to all, and vegetarian turkeys. And we'll see everybody next week. Tiffany, thanks again.
Thanks, Debbie. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for watching. Delta CX is available for consulting and projects related to CX and UX strategy, leadership, training, problem finding, problem solving, and innovation. Learn more at deltacx.com.